Experts Live, The Data Dilemma, Preparing for Changes in the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. It's great to see so many of you registering and joining us for this session, and hopefully this will be a great opportunity for you to find out what you need to know and also get those all-important questions answered. We're joined today by Leo from One Click LCA and Stephen from the Irish Green Building Council, who are going to fill you in on some of the important work that is happening over there. And in a moment, I'll pass over to our speakers to introduce themselves properly. But first, let me tell you what you can expect from today's session. So once I've passed over to our speakers, we'll get straight into the discussion. Leo and Stephen will be discussing the current challenges of comparing assessments, what the updates to the EPBD are and how they'll impact the industry. And we'll also hear how the Irish Green Building Council's Indicate programme is happening and what they're doing to achieve with that. And then we'll close with a live Q&A. So please do take the opportunity to pop your questions into the chat at any point during the session. If you're joining from Livestorm, you'll see the chat and questions panel down the right-hand side. If you're joining us on LinkedIn, you can add your questions into the comments directly. We'll get those questions up on screen later and aim to answer as many of those as we can. So that's it from me right now. I'll pass over to you, Leo, now to do some proper introductions and to kick off the discussion.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Laura. As mentioned, today we're going to be touching on those topics regarding the work that's being carried out by Stephen and IGBC's. But before that, as mentioned, a very, very quick introduction from myself. My name is Leonardo Poli. I'm life cycle assessment consultant at One Click LCA. I've been doing life cycle assessments for over 6 years now, in a broad range of different building types, locations, and sat in different positions along the supply chain or the or shareholder chain, if you wish. And as mentioned, I'm joined today by Stephen Barrett from the IGBC. Stephen, do you mind giving the attendees a bit of a short bio? I'm Stephen. I'm the whole life carbon lead at the Irish Green Building Council. I've been with the IGBC for coming up for 4 years now, looking at all things carbon related, trying to educate members on what it all means and what they can do to try and reduce the carbon footprint of their buildings. That's great. Thank you. So, as mentioned, today's conversation is something that, is very, very relevant. We see a number of different organizations, people, researchers tackling this same topic. So it's great to see that, Stephen, you getting involved as well. And we're going to start with some questions. First one being, what are the challenges associated with comparing results when carrying out a whole life carbon assessment? We mentioned that there's some work being done by yourself and IGBC. All the work is being done elsewhere. So, what have you found as a result of it? I think the biggest challenge currently is that people just want a headline number. They just want to be told this is your carbon footprint per square meter, but there's just there are so many questions behind that number that need to be answered and just aren't considered. So there's a knowledge gap there. The first thing that needs addressing, I think, is the knowledge gap of when you're talking about LCA, what exactly is it that you're talking about? LCA is a kind of a discipline, if you like, with its own rules and approach, which is not always understood. People just want to see that kind of number as low as possible. Now, the easiest way to get a low number is to miss things out of your number. But if you really understand LCA, then you'll understand that that's not an option. There is a scope and an actual inventory there that needs fulfilling and needs to be understood. So I think that is the primary challenge, if you like, is defining that scope and educating not just the LCA practitioner, but people around them, what those numbers actually mean. If you look at BREEAM and LEED, they have different scopes, levels, RICS
we all have different scopes. They're similar, but they're not the same. Another big part of it, when you look into this further, is when you look under the bonnet of a result, if you like, is how much of that scope has actually been addressed in an assessment. And currently, we don't have the kind of the regulatory requirements that anybody has the time or the, I suppose they have the inclination, but it's the time really to understand those figures and get under the bonnet and understand what they actually mean in relation to what are the requirements of whichever regime it is that's putting those requirements on them.
Absolutely. Sounds like much like other situations or other, issues that there might be in LCA is not a straightforward answer. As you mentioned, a number of key aspects to consider. You mentioned obviously the scope. You mentioned the inclusion or exclusion of that scope, depending on what manual you're trying to align. And do you see this kind of challenge arising more in certain projects at certain stages, or do you see this being a commonality across all assessments, regardless of what stage they're at and regardless of the location that they're in?
It's a commonality. I think currently things are done for lead and BREEAM points. The lower the points, the better the score, or rather, the lower the score, the better the points. So it's not done with any kind of, it's not done with rigor. It's done to just get the points. And so whatever the result, if it looks justifiable, then that's good enough. I think the EPBD hopefully is going to change that, because we will have a much clearer framework to work within. We'll understand each other's homework, if you like. And it will be important. Currently, it's just not up the agenda. It needs moving up the agenda. I think the EPBD will do that.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned the EPBD, and it's something that we are going to be asking specific questions just in a few moments. But before we do that, relating to the issues that you uncovered relating to comparability, the challenges, I wanted to ask, what are the possible solutions to this lack of comparability in relation to the issues that you mentioned, and how is your work and IGBC's work helping with that?
Yeah, I think what I've learned over the last couple of years, looking at the level of awareness of whole life carbon in the country, is that we need to be providing defaults, kind of saying this is the figure that you use in the absence of any other figure. Because currently, if you're quite savvy with this, you can look for nice looking defaults. If you're not so savvy, you accept whatever you're given first. So what we need is a kind of a national default. So a kind of a golden rule that says these are the figures unless you prove clearly and categorically otherwise why you should have a lower figure. Mm-hmm. So the work we're doing on Indicate, we're trying to do that. We're trying to provide not almost all, maybe almost all of the figures that you need for a whole life carbon assessment. But they come with the caveat that you can use alternatives, provided you can prove that you're actually implementing those alternatives. That way you've got consistency across the board. Everybody should have similar results until they go above and beyond to do something differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And how does this manifest in a more practical term? What can people expect as a result of that, or where is the end point? Is it more of a manual approach, or is it more something?
Certainly hope it's not manual. What we're trying to do is we're trying to provide a kind of a set of rules and defaults, if you like, that could be programmed into softwares. Mm-hmm. Because the other thing with whole life carbon assessments is they tend to get done after a building's designed, when it's difficult to make much change to that building's design. Just here's your result, take it. It would be much better if these things were done earlier during the design of the building, so that you kind of have a running score. Currently, what we have is we've got a great big Excel spreadsheet that does a lot of calculations for you, but there's no reason why all those calculations couldn't be programmed into softwares and BIM to make to make the job easier and happen in real time, rather than at the end of the day as a kind of an accountancy exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to also to clarify something. By manual, I think I communicated. I was more defining a bit of a practitioner's approach or practitioner's a guide of some sort, which obviously that could be, I guess, a potential solution. But I was just wondering, what would be the desired outcome from this?
Sorry, go on.
No. Yeah, I'll let you comment on this.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the desired outcome is to have a BIM program where, as you're drawing out your design, there is something in the background multiplying the quantities that you're drawing by a set of default figures, so that you've got that real-time answer, which you can obviously then manipulate if you can prove what products you're actually going to be using.
Of course. So then, I mean, latching on to what you mentioned, the need for, both clear communication, clear assumptions, but also a kind of governmental action. I think that kind of, connects us very well to the work being done on EPBD. Just first thing, would you like to just kind of break down a little bit how EPBD, what is going to be doing, how is going to help the industry, kind of more in general terms first, and then we're going to be connecting to what specific.
Yeah. So the EPBD is primarily about renovation and bringing the poorest performing buildings currently up to standard. So similar to whole life carbon assessments, it's about identifying the hotspots of the building stock, which in this case are those F and G rated buildings, and bringing them up to standard. But from a whole life carbon perspective, which is what we're here to talk about today, I think the key thing is the mandate that you need to carry out a whole life carbon assessment from 2028 for any building over 1,000 square meters. That's going to hopefully focus a lot of people's attention on what whole life carbon is and what we mean by whole life. And by whole life, we mean when products start to be mined, essentially. Harvested is better, but currently so many of our building materials start off in the ground rather than growing above ground. So it will hopefully draw attention to the whole supply chain, not just how does the building perform when you go into it, but where did the materials to create this building come from. And if we see that starting to happen for new build, the EPBD is primarily about renovation, but hopefully then we'll also see that spill over into the renovation wave that we all want to see as well, so that we're just really questioning more about the products that we're using in our buildings, and not just assuming that they appear on site ready to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Still on the EPBD, obviously we mentioned the part of the EPBD that we're mostly interested in is whole life carbon assessment. Is there any kind of inspiration being drawn from what the EPBD is doing at European level? Is there some hopes on what's been carried out in terms of methodology that we're hoping to see implemented or we're hoping to see benefiting?
I think the levels framework is, it is absolutely fundamental to this. And the way that the EPBD is going to work from a whole life carbon assessment point of view is that every member state will have to implement their own methodology for doing this. Now, I would say every member state needs to start by going away and looking at levels indicator 1.2, which is global warming potential across the life cycle. That provides the high level framework of what's required in an assessment. There are still quite a few questions that follow on from that, but certainly for consistency across member states, that's the starting point. That is the framework that the EPBD is going to ask you to address. That framework is also the same one that things like the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, looks at. We're starting to see now a couple of things coming in that complement the EPBD, and they are the CSRD, but also the CPR, Construction Products Regulations. So there will be a requirement for the carbon footprint of materials to be published if that material is to be allowed onto the European market. And that's really important. It gives us that data that currently we rely on EPDs or we rely on industry averages. In theory, the CPR will now make it mandatory for every product to supply its carbon footprint, if you like. I'm quite concerned about how that's going to work in practice in the sense of, do we have enough LCA experts at the product level to produce that kind of information at the speed and scale that we need? But at least it's there, and in theory it's going to happen. So, that's a good thing. I think coupled with that, we've got the taxonomy, which actually defines what a green building is. And again, the taxonomy goes back to that same levels manual, that indicator 1.2, to define what is the global warming potential of a building across its life cycle. So I think we're starting to see from Europe, a joining up of these things, the EPBD overarching, the taxonomy driving the money in the right direction, the CPR giving us the background data that we need on materials coming into the marketplace. The last one was the CBAM, so the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So that, in theory, prevents offshoring of emissions, if you like. So anything being imported into the EU should also have that carbon footprint with it too. So that transparency should help us do our whole life cycle assessments much, much easier, because we've got the data that we need alongside the products.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, it's really interesting or really good to see that you are mentioning things regarding the EPBD that were mentioned at the very beginning as one of the key elements that we need to focus on to guarantee comparability and to move forward with sustainable design. So, as many things in LCA and, generally speaking, in embodied carbon or carbon assessment, data is really essential moving forward. As soon as we get that data, as soon as we get some people that are using that data early stages, we're going to be able to build upon that. It's just about how do we implement that and how do we implement it in such a way that it's usable. So again, it's great to see that there is governmental intervention here. So then you mentioned already Indicate as a project that you are part of, and the IGBC is part of. Do you mind giving us a bit of a context as to what Indicate is in general, and then we're going to go into the aspects related to the topic of conversation?
Yeah, so Indicate is a project that we're doing as a kind of a forerunner to whole life cycle assessments being a requirement in Ireland. We're trying to get 50 assessments done of 50 buildings, but done consistently and done with consistent scopes, consistent assumptions about where the materials come from, consistent assumptions about what's going to happen to them, what will happen to the building during its life cycle, and what will happen at the end of its life cycle. So if you do this consistently, then you've got comparability from one building to the next. So we want to get 50 done so we can kind of understand the carbon footprints over the lifetimes of different typologies. So we do say, for example, 10 apartment blocks with the same assumptions, with the same background data. We can then start to say, okay, this is what's typical for a apartment block in Ireland today. And then we want to do that for other typologies as well. But more than that, we then want to publish the results, but also the methodology, so that people can do their assessments of their buildings and compare them with this average, if you like. So we have the national average. Here's the assessment method for coming to that conclusion. Now you use the assessment method and see how your building compares. We've done around 20 now, and we're starting to see numbers emerge, but the sample size is still very small. So we're trying to keep that ball rolling. And this is all leading up to changes in the BER system here in Ireland. So the SEAI, the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, are working towards introducing a building rating, a bit like your building energy rating, but it will be your building carbon rating. So this methodology will feed into that. It will provide one methodology for the whole country to use when doing a building assessment. Another advantage of that is that your neighbour will understand what you've done. When you talk about these numbers, they'll be able to say, what have you included there? And is it on the list, if you like, of things that need to be included? So it kind of, currently people are educating themselves in all kinds of different ways. We need everybody kind of focused on how you do a life cycle assessment consistently and do it well. And this is the groundwork for that, if you like.
Absolutely. Well, it's really interesting work. It's surely work that is needed in the industry to move forward, as we said, to guarantee that we move forward in a sustainable manner without having some negative effects, unexpected negative effects. And that's not only regarding CO2 or carbon emissions, but also other indicators. And obviously consistency, clear communication is key. And the question that I had is, you mentioned 20 projects. Are these projects that have been provided as case studies, or are these projects that have been developed for the purpose of this assessment? How are these projects?
No, quite the opposite. We just want standard projects. We don't want amazing projects, because that will give us amazing results. We want to understand where we are now and set our baselines. So we average and we aggregate a set of typical buildings rather than exemplar buildings, so that we know where we are now, so that we can start setting targets and start comparing that way.
That's great. And would these results be used to inform the IGBC or Ireland regulation in particular, or is this something that is going to be contributing to the industry as a whole, or industry as a whole in Europe?
Yeah, we think it is specific to Ireland. All of the assumptions, the background data are specific to Ireland, but there's no reason that you couldn't do similar in other countries. Where it feeds into legislation, I think, and hope, is that it provides the baseline, the typical building today. This is the carbon footprint of a building today. So where are we going to put our targets for 2027 and 2030? So it's really that kind of laying the foundations. This is what we do now. What should we be aiming to do, or what do we need to be aiming to do? That's what it seeks to address.
Moving forward, absolutely. Another question that I had that just kind of came up, we mentioned a number of times, one thing is the aspect of standard assumptions, especially say in assessments where I don't have that information from from the project. So you mentioned the importance of only specifying materials when they have been defined at procurement stage, or there's some sort of commitment from the developer to implement those. And all of these things, also relate to how well I communicate my design, how well I communicate this information to my design team, and then how the design team uses that information to move forward. And the one thing that keeps coming back to my head is reporting and how we clearly communicate this information. I was recently going through the EN 15978 standard, which is the building LCA. And whilst there's not too much information regarding third-party verification, one of the key terms that kept coming back was transparency of information, clear communication. And it's quite interesting that you have mentioned it a number of times. I just wanted to understand a little bit more if there's been any findings regarding the importance of clear communication, how that's been woven into the work that you are doing.
Yeah. So the way we approached it was we gave the methodology to, well, anybody who volunteered really, and asked developers, designers, quantity surveyors, architects, could you do an LCA of your building design using this methodology? And we learned a lot from that. We learned it was difficult because the scope of a building is much more than just the frame and the substructure and the walls. There's a lot more defined in the levels manual. So there's a lot of information to be gathered and shared. And we found there's kind of, it falls into two camps. It's people who are well organized and people who aren't. So we had one developer in particular who were doing an LCA on a building that was already finished. So they were trying to go back to every subcontractor and say, what did you use on this building? And they said it was a headache, but they also said, now we know it's a headache. The next time we do this, we will ask them at the beginning rather than now when we're asking them at the end. So it's been a really good learning exercise in what you need to know at the outset that will save you work later on when everybody's left the building and gone on to other projects. So what you need to know right at the beginning and the benefit of understanding it as early as possible to save you that work later, because they were glad they did it. They said it was hard work, but now we understand the next time it'll be much easier work. And I think that has been the key lesson for them, and probably the key lesson for everybody, I would think, is getting that data organized as early in the process as possible.
Absolutely. And then hopefully with the work that you're doing and stressing on the importance of clarifying these material information as early as possible, it will become no longer a nice to have, but an essentials to have, something that we can rely upon to then move forward with better solutions. So yeah, it seems like something that makes perfect sense, but at the same time, a lot of the time we need numbers to verify whether or not something is true, to bring forward to meetings, and it's great to see that the work is being done to support for that, because one thing is saying this is going to be doing good, but then the next question is how good and how much is it going to cost me? And so yeah, it's great to see that work being done.
Definitely on that, it's good, and how much is it going to cost me is an interesting one, because as well as the EPBD, which doesn't have an effect until 2028, the CSRD does today now. And my phone is starting to ring with people asking me, I've been asked by investors, what is the carbon footprint of my building? And I don't know what to tell them. So the EPBD is good, but the same question is already being asked now by investors and how much it's going to cost them. So another piece of advice, I think, is don't wait. It says 2028 in the legislation. Here in Ireland, we're aiming for late 2025. But the CSRD is already here, and that's, that is for investors to worry about. And investors are the people who actually pay for these things, and they're already on this. So we need to be too.
Absolutely. It's interesting how the same conversation the same concept that you mentioned earlier on of the earlier I implement sustainable design in buildings, the cheaper they can become to be sustainable. And the same kind of applies to also your processes, right? Like you just mentioned, apply that early. It's a bit like design sustainability early. Let's design for sustainable supply chain and having this awareness of what materials are put in as early as possible. As you said, before 2028. I mean, there's already some push anyways right now. So let's use that as a momentum to grow. The other thing that I will also mention off the back of that on costs, because obviously that's one thing that always comes back, is what are the implications of not doing this sort of work, and what are the implications of continuing with the supply chain as usual, and which is becoming more and more unsustainable as we are finding out, and especially not as future proofed as it should be. So yeah, again, just kind of stressing on the importance of what you just mentioned there.
I think a couple of things on cost. I don't know if there'll be a cost penalty for people not complying. The EPBD, it's left up to each member state to implement it, how they're going to regulate and what they're going to require. But I think on cost, a really massive benefit of whole life carbon assessments and life cycle analysis in general is looking down the road, and done in tandem with life cycle costing, I think, is something that doesn't get done enough and can lead to great savings now and in the future. If you're questioning how much of something you're putting in your building, whether it needs to go in the first place, if you can remove it, you can lower the carbon cost of your building, but you can also lower the financial cost if you design to do more with less. So thinking about what can you do with less, what parts of your building can you design out so they don't need maintenance and they don't need replacement further down the line. You can start to look at lowering the cost of running the building. So the more MEP you can take out of the building, the less your maintenance costs, hopefully the less your running costs too. So it gets you thinking more smartly about your building in the beginning, rather than just the capital cost of the building. What is the building over its lifetime in cost and carbon? And we are seeing a lot of QSs taking a great interest in whole life carbon assessments, because if you think of carbon as a currency alongside the money, you've got two columns instead of one now. How do you lower them both? I think that's going to be a big USP for some QSs going forward. The ones who really understand it, get their heads around it, can supply that CSRD data that needs to be known by investors. They're the guys who are going to win contracts, I think. So carbon as a cost, I think, is what we're going to see between now and 2030. And those who can understand it will be the guys who get the business.
Absolutely. And all of this is possible, even more possible, if we have sound foundations upon which we can build, and more reliable foundations. So again, it connects to that conversation that we started upon as kind of the founding, the founding ground, or like the rock bed of all of these things that we mentioned. It's extremely interesting things, and it's one can easily go down a rabbit hole, but I just conscious of time and not missing out on anything. So obviously one of the things that I wanted to ask is, how does one-click LCA software feed into this work? How's it been used to achieve assessing of results and feeding into the work as a whole?
The answer's not yet, but hopefully. So we've shared our methodology with OneClick, and they tell us that they don't see any problems with it. It's just a question of them having the time, I guess, to work it into the software. OneClick is, the market leader, and so whenever I talk to people about life cycle assessment, the conversation invariably it comes up pretty quickly. So if we could get assessments done using our methodology in OneClick, that would be great, because then we get a set of consistent assessments done on a tool that everybody's familiar with. But we will be aiming to share this methodology with anybody and everybody, so that any software producer can take the methodology, program it into their software or their BIM or whatever it is they're using, and produce those comparable results, which is what we want to see. And it's what industry wants to see, really. The industry wants a definition of what they're supposed to be doing here. There's still a lot of learning to be done. We've been kind of preaching whole life carbon for 2 or 3 years now. We've reached a lot of people, but I think only at a kind of a high level, because there hasn't been any requirement in the past. If there's no requirement, you're busy, you get onto other stuff instead. Now that requirements are appearing, I think we've got a good level of understanding in Ireland of what this is, but we don't have the detail and we don't have the practice, because it's not a requirement yet. Now that it's becoming a requirement, we'll get the practice. We've got the knowledge. I think we can do it.
Great. Thank you for that. And then closing this section, we mentioned a number of things that, everyone is aiming to get, especially you, Stephen, with the IGBC, with Indicate as well. And obviously that takes a lot of work. But if the final question is, if you had almost like a magic wand and you could just apply any of the things that you mentioned or anything else to the industry currently, what would that be from your perspective?
A realistic magic wand.
As realistic as you want it to be. It can also be, just something that you wish to see in the next few years in the industry.
I'd really like to see an increase in the use of timber and biomaterials. So I think that would need fire safety reviews and regs to change. But I think that the co-benefits of natural materials, of living with them, we've moved so far away from it over the 20th century. I think we might have even forgot what it feels like to stand in a wooden building. It's just a more natural, healthy place to be. I think there's an interesting set of warehouses in North Dublin, some built with CLT frames and some built with steel frames. The employees like being in the CLT frame building without giving a particular reason why, but it's biophilia, it's how we've evolved, and I think we've forgotten that.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. Lots of information and insight shared there. So thanks again. We're now going to open up the discussion to our audience and get some of our audience questions answered. So if you haven't already, please do drop those into the chat or questions box, and we'll try and get to those in the remaining time. So to our first question, who should be responsible for creating the life cycle assessment? If this task is assigned to dedicated LCA practitioners, what qualifications should they obtain to ensure their competency?
For doing an actual assessment, I think who should be responsible, I think it depends when in the life cycle of the building it's done. I think it should be done early and possibly not that accurately to begin with. There's a lot of worry that you're not getting the numbers right, but the earlier the assessment, the less accurate it's going to be, but the more useful it's going to be, because you can make changes. So possibly the person who should be responsible is the first people involved in setting out the principles of the building, or the materials palette, if you like. So early stage architects choosing the materials, choosing the energy approach. These are the people that can make the decisions that can lower that number the most. I know I said QSs are the guys who seem to be getting involved, but by the time they do it, it's quite late. You get the numbers, you understand it, but it's too late for making changes. So the earlier the better. So usually the architects and even the investors, the people who are putting up the money.
Leo, do you want to add anything to that?
Just saying, as a someone that used to be a consultant for a firm in the UK, from the consultant's perspective, I think it would be great to see everyone take responsibility for the LCA and really thinking of how does my activity impact the project as a whole, whether I specify something or I don't specify something. Can I do that? Is that my scope of action? And if it is, then you probably also should be responsible for clarifying information, because the consultant that does the assessment is not directly responsible for those emissions. The structural engineer is, the architect is, the MEP designer is, at different stages in time, as mentioned by Stephen. So on top of that, it's just about thinking, how does my design affect the overall results? If it does, then you can safely say that you are responsible for the full development before construction and after it has been constructed. So yeah, just sharing that burden as much as possible.
Great, thank you. And so our next question is, how countries like Portugal, with less developed databases, without local embodied energy data and scarce construction, produce EPDs, implement the new EPBD?
I can tell you what we've done in Ireland, which is to go to that manual, Indicator 1.2 of the EU levels framework. Look at what's in there. That defines what you need to be looking at when you're doing an assessment of your building. So, and what I mean by looking at is, what do you include in your building? What constitutes a building? But also, what's the time period? The EPBD levels says 50 years. So you're looking at a 50-year assessment. It also includes the likely replacement cycles of different elements of your building. So it's a starting point. It doesn't give you everything, but it tells you what parts of your building to include, what to assume is going to happen in this 50-year life cycle. And then what we've done in Ireland, and you could do in any country to some extent, we spoke to the Environmental Protection Agency and asked them what happens to different building materials at the end of life. So they told us what proportion of steel gets recycled, what proportion of concrete goes back into backfill, what proportion of construction waste ends up in landfill, that kind of thing. So you can do research of what happens in your country currently. For EPDs, the default data that we use is we've tried to calculate an average based on the market. So who are the big players in the Irish market? Say, if you take concrete, for example, who are the big suppliers? What information do they already publish? So these are the guys that you need to know about to come up with a kind of a weighted average for your country. And you can publish that, and then everybody in the country can use that weighted average.
Great, thank you. Next question we have is, levels covers parts like sockets, switches and sensors. Data is scarce, often overlooked early on. Might EPBD narrow early scope?
Yeah, I think this is something that we need to learn. So the scope is pretty detailed. And it's true that it's the big stuff that moves the needle. So what we've done, for example, similar to this talk about, sockets, switches, little things that aren't going to move the needle, figure out what is a realistic default, and it'll probably be very small compared to the overall result. So you have to balance what is worth working on and what is, spending hours and weeks to find a tiny number that doesn't change your overall result at all. So I think doing a few assessments where we understand everything, we can then start looking at the small things and saying, okay, we'll just put defaults on those until that particular industry publishes more research.
Mm-hmm. On this, I'll also just add that the importance of your scope, or the importance of what element need to be included, is also dependent on your scope. And obviously, we are talking about buildings where you have a facade and structure and finishes and all of those things. And obviously, when we talk about sockets and maybe, even trays for distribution of MEP or HVAC may not be that impactful, but obviously that can change depending on the scope of the assessment. And if you do a fit out or a refurbishment, that might become more important. So the more we do assessments of all types, the more we gather that information, and then there might be also some data that can be transported to new buildings, or benefit new building assessment as a result of these more detailed assessment being carried out. So, yeah, there's just something to mention that sockets can be something that we need to focus on depending on what is your scope and aim. Just something I wanted to say.
Great, thank you both. We have time for a few more questions. So the next one for you both is, what are the main challenges for companies adopting LCA in the Irish construction industry? Stephen, I guess that one's aimed directly at you.
Education is the first thing, understanding exactly what it is you're doing. And the second thing, I think, then is getting all your suppliers to provide you with that quantity information. I mean, embodied carbon calculations are straightforward in the sense that it's quantity multiplied by carbon factor. But you've got quantities of so many different things that you need to be organized in getting all your subcontractors supplying you with that quantity data. That's a big challenge. So firstly, understanding what data you need to get from them and then making sure you get it. I think that's the hardest part. That's where most time is spent.
Great, thank you. So now, next question, has reporting of results demonstrated important, I don't think that's worded quite correctly, but to ensure comparability of results, is any work being done in that field?
So it's the importance of comparability, maybe. I think it has, the work that we're doing is all about comparability. It's about consistent assumptions that are comparable. And the reason we've done it is because what we've seen in the past is different scopes lead to different results. So these two buildings, so it's always been known. One thing that I'm putting right on the front cover of an LCA assessment done using Indicate is the scope, what's required and what has been included in this particular building on the front page, so you can see straight away what's missing as much as what's included. And that for me is the most important thing when you're trying to compare to.
Great, thank you. So thank you very much for that, both of you. And if you didn't manage to have your question answered or something pops up after the session that you want to ask, don't worry, I'll provide contact details at the end. We'll make sure those are answered for you. And at this point, I'm just going to quickly ask if anyone wants to have a live demo of the One-Click LCA software and tools following the session, please do let us know now. So if you're joining in Livestorm, you'll see a poll pop up on your screen now. And if you're joining from LinkedIn, just drop a yes into the chat. I think there's also a link there where you can go in and directly book a demo. So please do that and we will be in touch shortly. And before we leave, I wanted to just let you know that if you're keen to carry on the conversation or find out more, One-Click LCA will be at the next Irish Green Building Council event, which is Build Green Now. That's taking place at Croke Park Stadium on the 3rd of May, and you can find out more about that event and register to attend on the IGBC website. And so if you enjoyed today's session, please do connect with our speakers on LinkedIn or reach out to them on email. They'll be more than happy to hear from you and answer any questions that you might have after the event. And so all that's left to say is a massive thank you again to both of our speakers, Leo and Stephen, and thank you to everyone who's joined us. Please do follow One Click LCA on LinkedIn to stay up to date with any other webinars and news, and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well, where you can find previous Carbon Experts Live episodes, as well as a wealth of other content. So thank you very much and see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye.